The cards fell like autumn leaves that night in Dead Rock Gulch, and with them fell the last shred of decency Garrett Sterling possessed. By dawn, he had wagered away more than just his gold claims and cattle ranch. He had bet the woman who wore his ring, the woman who carried his name, the woman who trusted him with her future. And when the sun crested the Montana peaks that morning, it would witness something no civilized person should ever see. A man's fiancée handed over like property to settle a gambling debt, until a stranger with Dakota blood in his veins and steel in his spine stepped forward to change everything. The autumn of 1887 had been cruel to the Montana Territory, but nowhere crueler than in the gambling halls of Dead Rock Gulch. The town squatted in a valley between two mountain ridges like a scar across the landscape, its main street a ribbon of mud and broken dreams. It was the kind of place where fortunes were made on Tuesday and lost by Thursday, where decent folks kept their heads down and their doors locked after sunset. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Garrett Sterling should have been one of the success stories. At 28, he owned 3 of the richest gold claims in the territory, a cattle ranch that stretched across 2 valleys and enough influence in Dead Rock to sway elections. His engagement to Victoria Hartwell had been announced in the territorial newspaper, complete with plans for a spring wedding that would unite 2 of the most prominent families west of the Rockies. Garrett wore success like an expensive coat, tailored to fit his broad shoulders and confident stride. But success had bred something rotten in Garrett Sterling's soul. The same instincts that had driven him to strike gold and build an empire now drove him to the poker tables that lined Dead Rock's saloons, like altars to greed. What had started as occasional games among business associates had evolved into nightly pilgrimages to establishments where fortunes changed hands faster than the dealing of cards. Garrett told himself he was networking, building connections, cementing his status among the territory's elite. The truth was simpler and more destructive. He had become addicted to the rush of risking everything on the turn of a card. Victoria knew something was wrong, but not the extent of it. She noticed the way conversations stopped when she entered rooms, the nervous glances exchanged between shopkeepers when her credit was mentioned, the increasing frequency of Garrett's late-night absences. When she questioned him, he deflected with kisses and promises, buying her silence with expensive gifts that she later learned were purchased on credit that stretched thinner each month. Victoria Hartwell had been raised to trust the man she was to marry, to believe that a woman's place was to support rather than question. It was a belief that would nearly destroy her. The slide had been gradual at first, a few $100s lost here, a land deed wagered there. Garrett's luck at the tables ran in streaks, magnificent wins that convinced him his losses were temporary setbacks, devastating defeats that drove him to bet even more recklessly to recover what he'd lost. By the autumn of 1887, he had secretly mortgaged 2 of his 3 gold claims, sold off a third of his cattle herd, and borrowed against his ranch house to fund his gambling habit. But Garrett Sterling was a master at maintaining facades, and to the outside world he remained the golden boy of Dead Rock Gulch. The fatal night began like so many others, with Garrett adjusting his silk vest and checking his pocket watch as he prepared for what he told Victoria was a business meeting. She kissed him goodbye at the door of their grand house on Prospect Hill, reminding him that they had an appointment with the preacher the next morning to finalize their wedding plans. Garrett smiled and promised to be home early, then walked into the Montana darkness toward a destiny that would shame them both. The Crimson Palace wasn't actually a palace, just a 2-story saloon with pretensions above its station. Red velvet curtains hung from every window, crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across tables where men's dreams went to die, and the air was thick with cigar smoke and desperation. It was the most expensive gambling establishment in Dead Rock, which meant it attracted both the wealthiest players and the most dangerous games. Garrett Sterling was a regular at the palace's high-stakes tables, known for his expensive clothes, easy laugh, and increasingly reckless betting. On this particular October night, he joined a game that had been running for 3 days straight, where the pot had grown so large that spectators gathered just to witness the carnage. The players were a collection of the territory's most notorious gamblers, railroad barons who built empires on other men's labor, cattle kings who measured their worth in thousands of acres, mining speculators who could buy and sell entire towns. On a whim, at the head of the table sat Silas Moorcock, a man whose reputation preceded him like the stench of sulfur. Moorcock was old Montana money, the kind that had been made through methods polite society preferred not to examine too closely. He owned silver mines, shipping companies, and politicians with equal ease, and his presence at any gambling table meant the stakes would be higher and the consequences more severe than most men could stomach. Moorcock had cold blue eyes that seemed to catalogue every weakness, every tell, every desperate decision his opponents made. He wore his expensive suits like armor, and his cruelty like a badge of honor. The game was 5-card stud, but the rules had been modified for men whose appetites exceeded normal limits. The betting had no ceiling, and players could wager anything of value: land, livestock, business interests, even human contracts if the territories were disputed enough to make such things negotiable. It was the kind of game that separated men from boys and often separated men from their sanity. Garrett started the evening well, winning several early hands that swelled his confidence and his stack of chips. But poker is a game where early success can be more dangerous than immediate failure, because it breeds the kind of overconfidence that leads to catastrophic decisions. As the night wore on and the whiskey flowed, Garrett's judgment began to cloud. He started calling bets he should have folded, raising when wisdom dictated caution, and most dangerously, he began to see patterns in the cards that existed only in his alcohol-soaked imagination. By 3 a.m, Garrett had lost everything he'd brought to the table and had begun signing promissory notes secured by his property. First went his smallest gold claim, then his prize stallion, then the lumber rights to a section of his ranch. Each loss was supposed to be the last. Each new bet was going to be the one that turned his fortunes around. But Silas Moorcock played poker the way a spider builds webs, with patience, precision, and an understanding that the prey would eventually trap itself. The fatal hand came just as dawn was breaking over the Montana peaks. Garrett held a full house, kings over tens, and was certain it was unbeatable. Across the table, Moorcock's expression remained as unreadable as carved stone, but something in the way he arranged his chips suggested confidence that made Garrett's blood run cold. The betting escalated quickly, with Garrett putting up his ranch house, then his remaining cattle, then his last gold claim. When Moorcock raised again, Garrett had nothing left to match the bet except the one thing he'd sworn never to risk. "I need collateral for 20,000, Garrett said, his voice steadier than his hands. The table fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner and the distant sound of the town coming to life. Moorcock leaned back in his chair, studying Garrett with the intensity of a naturalist examining a rare specimen. "What did you have in mind, Sterling?" Moorcock's voice was silk wrapped around steel, polite but predatory. Garrett's throat felt like sandpaper as he spoke the words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "Victoria Hartwell, my fiancée, her marriage contract, her person. If I lose, she becomes yours to do with as you see fit." The silence that followed was so complete that every man at the table could hear his own heartbeat. Even in a place where human dignity was routinely bartered away, there were lines that civilized men didn't cross. But Garrett Sterling was no longer a civilized man. He was a desperate gambler who had mistaken a good hand for salvation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. Moorcock's smile was the most terrifying thing anyone at the table had ever seen. Interesting collateral, Sterling, and if I win, you cancel all my debts and throw in your silver mine outside of Helena. Done. Moorcock's agreement came too quickly, too easily, and in that moment, Garrett Sterling realized he had made a mistake that would destroy more than just his own life. The cards were revealed with ceremony befitting such a momentous wager. Garrett's kings full of tens would have won most hands, would have secured his fortune and his future. But Silas Moorcock laid down 4 aces with the casualness of a man ordering breakfast, and in that instant, Victoria Hartwell's fate was sealed. The sun was rising over Dead Rock Gulch when Garrett Sterling stumbled out of the Crimson Palace, his expensive clothes wrinkled and stained, his face the color of old parchment. He had lost everything: his fortune, his property, his future, and most damningly, his fiancée. The marriage contract that should have protected Victoria now bound her to a man whose reputation for cruelty was matched only by his appetite for other men's suffering. Garrett's first instinct was to run. He could saddle his horse, ride hard for the territorial border, and disappear into anonymity somewhere the name Sterling meant nothing. But cowardice, like gambling, was a habit that grew stronger with each. Surrender to its temptations. Instead, he found himself walking slowly toward the house on Prospect Hill, where Victoria waited, trusting and unsuspecting, probably preparing tea and wondering why he'd missed their appointment with the preacher. The house looked different in the morning light, smaller somehow, as if his losses had physically diminished everything he'd once owned. The white picket fence that Victoria had insisted on now seemed like a mockery, a symbol of domestic tranquility that had been built on foundations of sand. Garrett stood at the gate for 10 minutes, watching smoke rise from the kitchen chimney, knowing that inside the woman he'd claimed to love was going about her morning routine, unaware that her life had been wagered away like a hand of cards. When he finally entered the house, Victoria was in the kitchen, wearing the blue dress she'd chosen for their meeting with the preacher. Her dark hair was pinned up in the style he'd always said he preferred, and she smiled when she saw him, the kind of trusting, loving smile that made what he had to tell her even more unforgivable. "Garrett, you look terrible. Were you out all night again?" Her voice carried concern rather than accusation, because Victoria Hartwell had been raised to give the benefit of the doubt to the man she was to marry. Garrett couldn't meet her eyes as he spoke. "Victoria, we need to talk. Something has happened." The words came out in a rush, tumbling over each other like water through a broken dam. He told her about the gambling, about the debts, about the losses that had mounted beyond his ability to control. But when he reached the part about wagering her marriage contract, the words stuck in his throat like broken glass. Victoria listened in growing horror, her face transforming from confusion to disbelief to a kind of sick understanding. When Garrett finally managed to explain that she now belonged to Silas Moorcock, that her engagement ring was meaningless, that she would be handed over like property to settle a gambling debt, Victoria's response was not tears or hysteria, but a silence so profound it seemed to echo off the kitchen walls. "You bet me," she said finally, her voice so quiet Garrett had to strain to hear it. "You bet me like I was a horse or a piece of land." "Victoria, I can explain. You bet me." The repetition was not a question, but a statement of fact so monstrous that her mind struggled to process it. "And you lost." Garrett reached for her, but Victoria stepped back as if his touch might contaminate her. The trust that had taken years to build crumbled in an instant, leaving behind something harder and colder than Montana granite. "When?" she asked. "Moorcock wants the transfer completed by sunset. There will be a ceremony of sorts to make it, legally binding. Victoria, I'm sorry, I never meant—" "Get out!" The words were spoken with such quiet finality that Garrett knew argument was useless. He started to protest, to explain, to beg forgiveness, but Victoria's eyes had gone dead in a way that frightened him more than Moorcock's cruelty ever could. "Get out of my house, Garrett Sterling. Get out and don't come back." As Garrett slunk away like a whipped dog, Victoria Hartwell stood alone in the kitchen of the house that was no longer hers, wearing the dress she'd chosen for wedding plans. That would never happen, trying to understand how a woman's entire life could be destroyed by the turn of a card. Outside, the sun climbed higher over the Montana peaks, marking the hours until sunset, when she would become the property of a man whose very name made decent folks cross themselves and lock their doors. But Victoria Hartwell was not just any woman. She was the daughter of pioneers who had crossed the plains with nothing but determination and died defending their homestead from raiders. She was the granddaughter of women who had survived the Trail of Tears and the Great Migrations that had carved civilization from wilderness. Her blood carried the strength of generations who had faced impossible odds and found ways to survive. As the morning wore on, and the reality of her situation sank in, Victoria began to plan. She might be trapped by legal contracts and territorial law, but she would not go to her fate as meekly as Garrett had surrendered her. If Silas Moorcock wanted to own her, he would discover that some things could not be possessed, regardless of what papers were signed or debts were paid. The sun continued its arc across the Montana sky, each passing hour bringing Victoria closer to a fate she had not chosen but would face with all the dignity she could muster. And somewhere in the growing crowd of townspeople who had heard about the unprecedented wager, a man with Dakota blood in his veins and steel in his spine was making plans of his own. The stage was set for a confrontation that would be remembered long after the last gambling debt was settled and the last card was played. But that story would have to wait for the sun to climb higher and the shadows to grow longer, because the most important events in life happen not in the bright light of noon, but in the uncertain hours when day meets night and destiny hangs. In the balance, like a coin spinning in the air, news traveled faster than wildfire through the narrow streets of Dead Rock Gulch, carried on the tongues of saloon girls and whispered between shopkeepers who had witnessed the impossible. By noon, every soul in the territory knew that Garrett Sterling had done the unthinkable. He had wagered his fiancée in a poker game and lost her to the most feared man in Montana. The story grew with each telling, becoming more elaborate and more horrifying as it passed from mouth to mouth like a contagion of shame. Victoria Hartwell spent the morning hours in a strange state of suspended animation, moving through her house like a ghost, haunting rooms that no longer belonged to her. She touched familiar objects, the china teacup her mother had given her, the lace curtains she had sewn by hand, the photograph of her and Garrett taken on their engagement day, as if memorizing them before they too were swept away by the tide of her ruined life. Each item felt precious and meaningless simultaneously, artifacts of a woman who had ceased to exist the moment 4 aces were laid upon a poker table. The first visitors arrived before the church bells had finished chiming. The noon hour, Mrs. Eleanor Prescott, the banker's wife and self-appointed guardian of Dead Rock's moral standards, appeared at Victoria's front door with 2 other ladies in tow, their faces arranged in expressions of carefully practiced sympathy that barely concealed their excitement. At being so close to such delicious scandal, "Victoria, dear child," Mrs. Prescott began, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "we came as soon as we heard. Surely there's been some mistake. Surely no Christian man would—" She trailed off deliberately, forcing Victoria to fill in the unspeakable details. But Victoria had underestimated the appetite for shame that lurked beneath Dedrock's civilized veneer. These women hadn't come to offer comfort. They had come to feast on her humiliation, to carry away choice morsels of degradation that they could serve at tea parties for months to come. Victoria saw the hunger in their eyes, the way they leaned forward slightly when she spoke, the barely suppressed smiles that tugged at the corners of their mouths when they thought she wasn't looking. "There's been no mistake," Victoria said, quietly, her voice steady despite the earthquake in her chest. "Garrett Sterling wagered me in a poker game last night, and I now belong to Silas Moorcock." The words fell into the parlor like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples of shock and secret delight among her visitors. Mrs. Prescott's hand flew to her throat in a gesture of theatrical horror, while her companions exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their true feelings. "Belong to him," Mrs. Prescott whispered, as if speaking too loudly might make the scandal more real. "But surely the territorial authorities won't recognize such an arrangement? A woman isn't property to be wagered away like cattle or land claims." Victoria's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "Isn't she? My engagement contract was legal binding, Mrs. Prescott. It transferred certain rights and responsibilities regarding my person to my intended husband. Those rights have now been reassigned." The silence that followed was broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock and the barely audible intake of breath from women who were simultaneously horrified and titillated by the depths of Victoria's fall from grace. In their minds, they were already composing the letters they would write to friends and relatives in other territories, spreading the story of the woman who had been gambled away like a hand of cards. But Victoria's ordeal was far from over. Throughout the afternoon, a steady stream of visitors made their way to Prospect Hill, each claiming to offer support while actually seeking confirmation of the rumors that had set the territory ablaze with gossip. Some came bearing gifts, flowers, food, small tokens of sympathy that felt more like funeral offerings than gestures of comfort. Others came empty-handed but full of questions, probing for details that would fuel their dinner conversations for weeks to come. The most painful visit came from Father McKenna, the elderly Irish priest who had been preparing to perform Victoria's wedding ceremony. He arrived in the late afternoon, his weathered face creased with genuine sorrow and confusion, carrying the leather-bound book where he had recorded the banns of marriage that would now never be read. "Child," he said, settling his arthritic frame into the chair beside Victoria's settee, "I've heard things today that I pray are not true. Tell me that Garrett Sterling hasn't done what the whole territory is saying he's done." Victoria looked at the old priest, this man who had baptized her, confirmed her, counseled her through the uncertainties of approaching marriage, and felt something crack inside her chest. Here finally was someone whose horror wasn't tinged with excitement, whose sympathy wasn't seasoned with scandal hunger. "It's true, Father," she whispered, and for the first time that day, tears began to slide down her cheeks. "He bet me in a card game, and he lost." Father McKenna closed his eyes and moved his lips in what Victoria assumed was a prayer, though it might have been a curse in his native Gaelic. When he opened them again, his gaze was steel wrapped in kindness. "The Church does not recognize gambling debts as binding in matters of marriage," he said firmly. "You are not bound by this abomination." "The territorial law says otherwise," Victoria replied. "Silas Moorcock has legal claim to my marriage contract. The authorities won't intervene." "Then we'll find another way," the priest said, reaching out to take her hands in his gnarled fingers. "You're not chattel to be bought and sold, Victoria. Hartwell, you are a child of God, and God does not abandon his children to the darkness." His words were meant to comfort, but Victoria found them hollow. If God truly watched over his children, how had he allowed her to be wagered away by the man she trusted most. How had he permitted such an obscene transaction to be legally binding? She kept these thoughts to herself, not wanting to wound the old priest's faith, even as her own crumbled like sandstone in a storm. As the day wore on, Victoria realized that the visits from well-meaning neighbors and scandal seekers were merely the prelude to a more orchestrated humiliation. Word came via a messenger boy, barely old enough to understand the import of the message he carried, that Silas Moorcock expected her to present herself at the Crimson Palace at 4 o'clock for a formal transfer of property. The phrase made Victoria's stomach turn, but she understood its significance. Moorcock wasn't content to simply claim his winnings in private. He intended to make a public spectacle of her degradation, to parade his newest acquisition before the very people who had known her as an independent woman of good family and sterling reputation. Victoria spent an hour deciding what to wear to her own humiliation. The blue dress she had chosen for her wedding consultation seemed wrong, tainted by association with happier times. The black dress she wore to funerals felt too dramatic, too much like surrender. In the end, she chose a simple grey wool dress, one that spoke of dignity without ostentation, mourning without melodrama. She pinned her hair up severely, applied no cosmetics, and wrapped herself in a cloak that would hide as much of her shame as possible. The walk from Prospect Hill to the Crimson Palace was the longest journey of Victoria's life, though it covered less than half a mile. Every step took her further from the life she had known, and closer to a future that terrified her beyond description. The streets that had once felt familiar and welcoming now seemed hostile, filled with faces that turned to follow her progress. With expressions ranging from pity to prurient curiosity, children stopped their games to stare at her. Women clutched their shawls tighter as she passed, as if her shame might be contagious. Men tipped their hats with exaggerated politeness that felt more mocking than respectful. Victoria kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, her spine rigid with the pride that was all she had left to call her own. The Crimson Palace looked different in daylight, less elegant and more shabby, like a painted woman seen in harsh morning light. The red velvet curtains that had seemed luxurious by lamplight now appeared tawdry and worn. The gilt trim on the doorframe was chipped and tarnished. Even the building seemed to mock her, revealing its true nature now that she was about to become part of its sordid business. A crowd had gathered outside the saloon, drawn by the promise of witnessing something unprecedented in the territories. Brief history. Victoria recognized many of the faces, shopkeepers who had extended her credit, ladies who had served on church committees with her, men who had tipped their hats respectfully when she passed them on the street. Now they stared at her with a mixture of fascination and revulsion, the way people might gawk at a public execution or a traveling freak show. Silas Moorcock waited for her on the palace's front porch, dressed in his finest black suit and wearing an expression of satisfied ownership that made Victoria's skin crawl. He was flanked by two men she didn't recognize, expensive lawyers from Helena, she assumed, brought in to ensure that the transfer of property was conducted with all the legal formalities that would make it unassailable in territorial court. "Miss Hartwell," Moorcock said, his voice carrying clearly to the assembled crowd, "how punctual of you. I appreciate a woman who understands the importance of honoring commitments, even when those commitments were made on her behalf by others." The casual cruelty of his words was breathtaking. With a single sentence, he had reduced her from an independent woman to a piece of property whose value lay in her obedience to masculine authority. The crowd murmured appreciatively, feeding on the drama like vultures picking at carrion. "Mr. Moorcock," Victoria replied, proud that her voice remained steady despite the trembling in her knees. "I am here because the law compels me to be here, not because I recognize any moral authority in this transaction." Moorcock's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "The law is the only authority that matters in civilized society, Miss Hartwell. Morality is a luxury that men like Garrett Sterling surrender when they sit down at my poker table. One of the lawyers stepped forward, unrolling a document that crackled with official seals and legal terminology. "This is a formal transfer of marital contract," he announced in a voice trained to carry across courtrooms. "By the terms of the gambling debt incurred by one Garrett Sterling and witnessed by 7 men of good standing, all rights and privileges pertaining to the marriage contract of Miss Victoria Hartwell are hereby transferred to Mr. Silas Moorcock." The words fell on the crowd like a physical blow. Several women gasped audibly. A few men removed their hats as if attending a funeral. Children were hastily pulled away by parents who suddenly realized that some spectacles were too adult for young eyes. "Do you have anything to say before we proceed?" Moorcock asked Victoria, and she could hear the amusement in his voice. He was enjoying this, savoring every moment of her public degradation like a fine wine. Victoria looked out at the faces surrounding her, people she had known for years, people she had considered friends and neighbors, people who were now watching her be transferred from one man to another like a broodmare being sold at auction. She saw pity in some eyes, shame in others, and in far too many, the gleeful excitement of witnesses to a spectacular downfall. "I have something to say," Victoria said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I want everyone here to remember this moment. Remember the day when a woman's life was treated as a gambling chip, when human dignity was wagered away in a card game, when the law of this territory showed its true face. Remember it, and ask yourselves what kind of civilization you're building. In this wilderness," her words hung in the air like an accusation, and Victoria saw some faces in the crowd flush with shame. But Moorcock only laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "How eloquent," he said. "I can see why Sterling was so reluctant to lose you. Such passion will serve my household well." The lawyer cleared his throat impatiently. "If we might proceed with the formalities?" "Of course," Moorcock said. "Miss Hartwell, please step forward and place your hand on the document to indicate your compliance with the terms of transfer." Victoria looked at the paper that would legally bind her to a man she despised, a document that would strip away her independence and reduce her to property. Her hand trembled as she raised it, and for a moment she wondered if she had the strength to go through with this charade. Then she thought of her pioneer ancestors, women who had faced impossible choices and found ways to survive them. She thought of her grandmother, who had buried 3 children on the trail west but kept walking toward tomorrow. She thought of her mother, who had defended their homestead with a rifle while her father lay dying of fever. Victoria Hartwell placed her hand on the document, but she did not surrender. In her mind, she was already planning, already looking for the cracks in Moorcock's armor, already preparing for the war that would surely come. "The transfer is complete," the lawyer announced. "Miss Hartwell is now legally bound to Mr. Moorcock, under the terms of territorial marriage law." The crowd began to disperse, their appetite for spectacle satisfied for the moment. But Victoria remained standing on the porch of the Crimson Palace, no longer a free woman, but not yet defeated. She had lost this battle, but the war for her soul was far from over. And somewhere in the dispersing crowd, a man with Dakota blood in his veins watched the proceedings with eyes that burned like prairie fire, already making plans that would shake the foundations of Dead Rock Gulch before another sunset painted the Montana sky. 3 miles outside Dead Rock Gulch, where the valley floor gave way to rolling hills dotted with pine and aspen, stood a ranch that most townspeople had heard of, but few had ever seen. The Broken Arrow spread across nearly 2,000 acres of some of the finest grazing land in the territory, but it was run by a man who valued privacy above profit and solitude above social standing. His name was Jesse Crow Feather, though the few who knew him well enough to use his first name simply called him Jesse. To everyone else, he was just the half-breed rancher, a designation that carried both respect and wariness in equal measure. Jesse had been watching Dead-Rock Gulch with growing concern for months, not because he cared about the town's politics or business dealings, but because he recognized the signs of a community slowly poisoning itself with greed and moral compromise. He had seen it before in other boom towns across the territories, the way prosperity could corrupt a place until decent folks became complicit in indecent acts. But what had happened to Victoria Hartwell crossed a line that Jesse couldn't ignore, no matter how much he preferred to keep his distance from the white man's troubles. He had been in town on the day of the transfer, standing at the back of the crowd that had gathered to witness Victoria's humiliation. Jesse hadn't come for the spectacle. He'd ridden into Dead-Rock to purchase supplies and had found himself trapped by the press of bodies surrounding the Crimson Palace. He'd watched the proceedings with mounting anger, his mixed heritage allowing him to see the situation through eyes unclouded by the cultural assumptions that had allowed such an obscenity to take place. Jesse's mother had been Dakota, from the Ndewa Canton band that had once hunted these very hills before the white settlers arrived with their papers and their laws. His father had been a Scottish trader who'd respected the Dakota way of life enough to marry into it rather than trying to change it. Jesse had grown up straddling two worlds, never fully accepted by either, but learning the best and worst of both cultures. From his mother's people, he had inherited a deep respect for women as the backbone of tribal life, the keepers of wisdom and the makers of decisions that affected the whole community. From his father's people, he had learned the white man's laws and customs well enough to navigate them when necessary. The sight of Victoria Hartwell being legally transferred from one man to another like a piece of livestock had offended every principle Jesse held sacred. In Dakota culture, a woman's consent was paramount in matters of marriage. A man who tried to force or trade a woman against her will would face the collective wrath of the entire tribe. But here in the white man's world, such an act was not only legal, but publicly celebrated by a crowd that should have been ashamed to witness it. Jesse had left town that day with Victoria's image burned into his memory. The way she had held herself with dignity despite her humiliation, the steel in her voice when she'd addressed the crowd, the unbroken spirit that shone through even as she was being stripped of her freedom. He'd ridden home in silence, his jaw clenched tight with anger that had nowhere to go and nothing to strike. But Jesse Crowfeather was not a man who simply accepted injustice because it was legal. He had spent 3 days considering his options, weighing the risks and consequences of involving himself in white man's business. He'd walked the boundaries of his ranch, seeking the counsel of the land itself, listening to the whispers of wind, through grass and the conversations of crows that had given him part of his name. By the third sunset, he knew what he had to do. Jesse's first step was information. If he was going to challenge Silas Moorcock, he needed to understand exactly what legal ground the man stood on and where it might be weakest. This required a delicate approach, because asking too many direct questions would alert Moorcock to his interest and potentially make the situation worse for Victoria. He began with old Ben Yazzie, a Navajo horse trader who did business throughout the territory and had a network of contacts that rivaled any telegraph system. Ben was one of the few men in the region who understood what it meant to live between two worlds, and Jesse trusted him with secrets he wouldn't share with anyone else. "You hear about what happened in Dead-Rock?" Jesse asked as they sat around Ben's campfire, sharing coffee that was strong enough to wake the dead. Ben nodded grimly. "Heard about it from 3 different sources, each one more shameful than the last. White man's law is a strange thing, Jesse. Calls itself civilized while allowing the most uncivilized acts." "What do you know about Moorcock?" "More than I'd like." 2. Ben spat into the fire where it hissed and steamed. "Man's got fingers in every dirty deal from here to Helena. owns judges, buys legislators, makes problems disappear for anyone willing to pay his price. But he's careful, always operates within the letter of the law, even when he's violating its spirit. Jesse had suspected as much. Men like Moorcock didn't survive and prosper in the territories without understanding exactly how far they could push without breaking. What about the gambling debt? Is it really legal? Unfortunately, yes. Territory recognizes gambling debts as binding contracts, especially when they're witnessed by men of standing, and Moorcock made sure to have plenty of witnesses to Sterling's wager. Ben studied Jesse's face in the firelight. "You thinking of doing something about this?" "Maybe." Ben was quiet for a long moment, considering the implications. "Jesse, I've seen what happens to men who cross Moorcock. They tend to have accidents, bad ones." "I'm not easy to accident," Jesse replied, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of a man who had survived things that would have broken lesser spirits. The next day, Jesse rode into Helena, the territorial capital, where he spent 2 days in the law library, reading every statute and precedent he could find regarding gambling debts, marriage contracts, and property transfers. He wasn't a lawyer, but his father had taught him to read legal documents, and his Dakota heritage had given him the patience to work through complex problems one piece at a time. What he discovered was both encouraging and troubling. The law was indeed on Moorcock's side, but it wasn't as ironclad as everyone seemed to believe. There were precedents for challenging gambling debts on grounds of fraud, coercion, or violation of public policy. The problem was that such challenges required evidence, testimony, and legal representation that could cost more than most people could afford. But Jesse also discovered something else, buried in the territorial statutes governing marriage contracts. A provision that had been written to protect Native American women from being forced into marriages with white traders contained language that could potentially be applied to Victoria's situation. The law stated that no woman could be bound by a marriage contract to which she had not given explicit witnessed consent. Victoria had been forced to sign the transfer document, but she had never consented to the original gambling wager that had made the transfer possible. It was a thin thread to hang a legal challenge on, but it was something. Jesse spent his last day in Helena identifying lawyers who might be willing to take such a case. Men with reputations for fighting lost causes and standing up to powerful interests. He found 3 possibilities, but only one who agreed to meet with him immediately. Samuel Whitehorse was a Cherokee lawyer who had graduated from Harvard Law School and returned to the territories to fight for indigenous rights. He was young, brilliant, and angry enough to take on a case that more established lawyers would avoid. When Jesse explained the situation, Whitehorse's eyes lit up with the fire of a man who had found a worthy opponent. "This is exactly the kind of case that needs to be fought," Whitehorse said, his voice carrying the passion of a crusader. "Not just for this woman, but for the principle it represents. If we let men trade women like poker chips, what's next? Children, slaves, the whole concept of human dignity. Can we win?" Jesse asked directly. Whitehorse considered the question carefully. "In a fair court, with an honest judge, I'd say we have a fighting chance. The problem is that Moorcock owns too many people in this territory. We'd need to be very careful about where and how we file the challenge." Jesse left Helena with a plan forming in his mind, but he knew that legal challenges would take time, and time was something Victoria Hartwell might not have. Moorcock wasn't the kind of man to wait for the law to catch up with his desires. If Jesse was going to help Victoria, he might need to act before the lawyers could file their first motion. Victoria had been living in Silas Moorcock's mansion for 4 days, and each one had been an exercise in psychological warfare. Moorcock hadn't touched her yet, but his presence in the house was a constant reminder of her powerlessness. He would appear without warning in doorways, watching her with eyes that catalogued her every movement like a predator studying prey. He spoke to her with exaggerated politeness that somehow felt more threatening than open hostility. The mansion itself was a monument to Moorcock's ego, filled with expensive furniture, imported artwork, and luxuries that spoke of wealth accumulated through methods that didn't bear close examination. Victoria had been given a room on the second floor, elegantly appointed, but equipped with locks that only worked from the outside. She was a prisoner in a gilded cage, waiting for her captor to decide what use she would be put to. On the fourth evening, as Victoria sat by her window watching, the sun set over the mountains that surrounded Deadrock Gulch, she noticed a figure on horseback on the ridge overlooking the mansion. The distance was too great to make out details, but something about the rider's posture suggested he was watching the house with more than casual interest. As the light faded, the figure disappeared, but Victoria found herself looking for him. Again the next evening, the rider appeared 3 nights in a row, always in the same spot, always watching the house until darkness made observation impossible. On the 4th night, Victoria saw him make his way down from the ridge, moving closer to the mansion under cover of darkness. Her heart began to race. Was this some new threat, or could it possibly be help? The answer came in the form of a small stone tapped against her window. Victoria approached cautiously, looking down to see a figure standing in the shadows of the garden below. He gestured for her to open the window, and after a moment's hesitation, she complied. "Miss Hartwell," the figure called up in a voice that was barely above a whisper. "My name is Jesse Crow Feather. I was in town the day of your transfer. I want to help you." Victoria's first instinct was suspicion. In her current situation, trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. "Why?" she whispered back. "Because what happened to you was wrong. Because no person should be treated like property. Because sometimes doing the right thing is more important than staying safe." There was something in his voice, a quiet sincerity that cut through Victoria's defenses. "What kind of help?" "I've been to Helena, talked to lawyers. There might be a way to challenge the legality of Moorcock's claim. But I need to know, are you willing to fight? Because if we do this, Moorcock will make our lives very difficult." Victoria looked down at the shadowy figure who had appeared like an answer to prayers she hadn't dared to voice. She thought of the 4 days she had spent as Moorcock's prisoner, the way he looked at her like merchandise he was considering purchasing, the future that stretched ahead of her like a long tunnel with no light at the end. "Yes," she whispered, and the word felt like the first free choice she had made since Garrett Sterling had wagered her away. "I'm willing to fight." Jesse stepped slightly out of the shadows, and in the moonlight, Victoria could see his face clearly for the first time. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 30, with features that spoke of mixed heritage and eyes that held depths of experience beyond his years. There was strength in his face, but also gentleness, and Victoria found herself trusting this stranger in a way that surprised her. "Then here's what we're going to do," Jesse said, his voice carrying quiet authority. "Tomorrow night, Moorcock is hosting a poker game for some territorial politicians. The house will be busy, and security will be focused on protecting the game. Rather than watching you, I'll create a distraction around midnight, and when I do, you need to be ready to leave. Can you manage that?" Victoria nodded, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement. "Where will we go?" "Somewhere safe, where Moorcock can't reach you while we fight this in court." "But Victoria," Jesse's voice grew serious, "once we do this, there's no going back. Moorcock won't forgive being defied, and he'll use every resource at his disposal to destroy both of us. Are you sure you're ready for that kind of war?" Victoria thought of the alternative. A lifetime as Silas Moorcock's property, subject to his whims and desires, never again free to make her own choices. The prospect of fighting back, even against impossible odds, felt like water to a woman, dying of thirst. "I've been ready since the moment I was forced to sign that transfer document," she said, and her voice carried steel that hadn't been there 4 days ago. "I may have been bought and sold like cattle, but I'm not cattle. I'm a human being, and I intend to prove it." Jesse smiled, and Victoria could see approval in his expression. "Then tomorrow night we begin your war for freedom. Be ready, Miss Hartwell. Your life is about to change again, but this time you'll be the one making the choices." As Jessie melted back into the shadows, Victoria closed her window and sat on her bed, her mind racing with plans and possibilities. For the first time since Garrett Sterling had destroyed her life with a handful of cards, she felt something she had almost forgotten: hope. Tomorrow night couldn't come soon enough. The day of the planned escape dawned grey and threatening, with storm clouds building over the Montana peaks like an army preparing for battle. Victoria woke before sunrise, her body thrumming with nervous energy that made sleep impossible. She had spent the night going over Jesse's plan again and again, memorizing every detail, preparing for every contingency she could imagine. By the time pale light began filtering through her bedroom window, she felt like a coiled spring ready to release. Silas Moorcock's mansion buzzed with activity throughout the morning as servants prepared for the evening's high-stakes poker game. Victoria watched from her window as wagons arrived carrying cases of expensive whiskey, imported cigars, and delicacies that would impress the territorial politicians Moorcock was hosting. She recognized some of the men who came to oversee the preparations: judges, legislators, and territorial officials who had sold their integrity so completely that they no longer bothered to hide their corruption. The irony wasn't lost on Victoria, that her escape would take place during another poker game, another gathering of men who treated human lives as commodities to be wagered and won. But this time, instead of being the prize, she would be the player making her own bet, risking everything on the chance that freedom was worth whatever price Moorcock would extract in revenge. Moorcock himself appeared at her door around noon, impeccably dressed as always, carrying himself with the smug satisfaction of a man who owned everything he surveyed, including the woman standing before him. His pale blue eyes swept over Victoria with the casual possessiveness that had become sickeningly familiar over the past 5 days. "Victoria, my dear," he said, his voice silk wrapped around steel, "I trust you're settling into your new circumstances. Tonight, I'm entertaining some very important men, territorial officials who appreciate discretion in their business dealings. I thought you might join us for dinner. Give my guests the opportunity to meet Deadrock's most famous resident." The invitation was clearly not optional, and Victoria understood the subtext immediately. Moorcock wanted to parade her before his corrupt associates, to demonstrate his power by showing off the woman he had acquired through a gambling debt. She would be displayed like a trophy, proof of his ability to take whatever he wanted through legal manipulation and raw intimidation. "I'd prefer to remain in my room," Victoria replied, keeping her voice level despite the revulsion churning in her stomach. Moorcock's smile sharpened like a blade. "I'm afraid that wasn't a request, my dear. As your legal guardian, I insist that you join us. It would be unwise to disappoint men of such influence." Victoria felt the familiar helplessness wash over her, the crushing weight of being property rather than person. But underneath the despair, something harder was growing, a determination that had been forged in the fires of humiliation and tempered by the promise of rescue that waited just hours away. "Of course," she said, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "I wouldn't want to be unwise." Moorcock studied her face, looking for signs of the submission he expected from his possessions. What he saw instead was a woman who had learned to hide her true thoughts behind a mask of compliance, and something about her composure seemed to unsettle him. "Excellent," he said finally. "Dinner is at 7. Wear something appropriate." These men appreciate beauty, and I want them to understand the quality of my acquisitions." After he left, Victoria sat on her bed and allowed herself 5 minutes of pure rage. She let the anger flow through her like molten metal burning away, the last vestiges of the naive woman who had trusted Garrett Sterling with her future. When the 5 minutes were over, she felt cleaner somehow, as if the fury had cauterized wounds that had been festering since the night of the fatal poker game. The dining room in Moorcock's mansion had been transformed into a stage set for corruption, with crystal chandeliers casting golden light over a table laden with silver and expensive china. The guests were exactly what Victoria had expected, a collection of territorial officials whose moral flexibility had made them wealthy at the expense of the people they were supposed to serve. Judge Harrison Blackwood presided over the gathering. Like a king holding court, his massive frame draped in expensive cloth that couldn't disguise the rot beneath. He was famous throughout the territory for verdicts that could be purchased like merchandise, and his presence at Moorcock's table spoke volumes about the host's influence. Senator Marcus Vance sat to Blackwood's right, a thin man with nervous eyes who had made his fortune selling land grants to his political cronies, while legitimate settlers were turned away empty-handed. His wife had died the previous winter, some said from shame at her husband's corruption, and he'd been drinking heavily ever since. Territorial Attorney General Philip Cross completed the triumvirate of corruption, a man whose office had become a marketplace where justice was auctioned, off to the highest bidder. Cross had a reputation for prosecuting innocent men while allowing guilty ones to walk free, depending entirely on who was willing to pay for his services. Victoria was seated at Moorcock's right hand, positioned like a centerpiece for the entertainment of his guests. The conversation flowed around her like sewage, filled with casual discussions of bribes taken, verdicts bought, and laws twisted to serve private interests. These men spoke of their corruption with the pride that honest men reserved for legitimate accomplishments. "Silas, you've outdone yourself with this acquisition," Judge Blackwood said, his small eyes fixed on Victoria with undisguised lechery. "Sterling always did have excellent taste in women. Pity he didn't have better sense with cards." "Garrett Sterling was a fool who confused luck with skill," Moorcock replied, cutting into his steak with surgical precision. "Men like that always overreach eventually. The wise course is to be there when they fall, ready to claim whatever they drop." Senator Vance leaned forward, wine loosening his tongue. "Speaking of claims, I understand you're interested in expanding your holdings in the Bitterroot Valley. There might be some territorial land coming available soon if you know the right people to speak with." "I always know the right people to speak with, Marcus," Moorcock said, his smile never reaching his eyes. "That's why I've never lost anything I truly wanted." Victoria sat in silence, forcing herself to eat while her stomach rebelled against both the food and the company. She felt like she was dining with demons, men who had sold their souls so completely that they no longer remembered what it felt like to be human. Every word they spoke was a reminder of the system that had made her situation possible, the web of corruption that allowed men like Moorcock to prosper while decent people suffered. As the evening wore on, the conversation grew more explicit, with Moorcock's guests making increasingly crude comments about Victoria's appearance and speculating about her usefulness to her new owner. She endured it all with the stoicism of a prisoner awaiting execution, counting the minutes until she could excuse herself and prepare for Jesse's rescue attempt. The poker game began at 9 o'clock, with the dining room transformed into a gambling den that would have made the Crimson Palace look respectable by comparison. The stakes were higher than money. These men were wagering political favors, judicial decisions, and territorial appointments with the casual indifference of men who had forgotten that their actions affected real people's lives. Victoria was dismissed to her room as the cards were dealt, but not before Moorcock made it clear that she was expected to be available if his guests expressed interest in her company later in the evening. The implication was unmistakable, and Victoria had to summon every ounce of self-control to keep from screaming her defiance at the assembled corruption. Back in her room, Victoria prepared for the most important gamble of her life. She had packed a small bag with essential items, hiding it under her bed where the servants wouldn't notice it during their daily cleaning. She'd chosen her darkest dress and warmest cloak, clothing that would help her blend into the shadows once she left the mansion's grounds. The sound of voices and laughter drifted up from the dining room below, punctuated by the occasional outburst of anger or triumph as fortunes changed hands. Victoria could hear Moorcock's voice above the others, smooth and confident, orchestrating the evening's corruption like a conductor leading a symphony of sin. At 11:30, Victoria stationed herself by the window, watching for Jesse's signal. The storm that had been building all day was finally beginning to break, with lightning flickering in the distance and wind whipping through the trees that surrounded the mansion. The weather would provide perfect cover for their escape, making it harder for pursuit to follow their trail. As the clock tower in town chimed midnight, Victoria saw movement in the shadows near the mansion's stables. A moment later, the building erupted in flames that seemed to leap from nowhere, painting the night sky orange and sending Moorcock's horses into a panic that could be heard throughout the valley. The effect on the mansion was immediate and dramatic. Servants ran shouting through the hallways, and Victoria could hear Moorcock's voice, bellowing orders as his guests stumbled outside to gawk at the spectacle. The entire household's attention was focused on the fire, creating exactly the distraction Jesse had promised. Victoria grabbed her bag and slipped out of her room, moving quickly but quietly through corridors that were empty for the first time. Since her arrival, she could hear the chaos outside, men shouting orders, horses whinnying in terror, the crackle of flames consuming the stable that had housed Moorcock's prize thoroughbreds. The kitchen door was unlocked, left open by servants, who had rushed outside to help fight the fire. Victoria slipped through it like a ghost, stepping into the garden where Jesse waited in the shadows, holding the reins of two horses that stamped nervously at the smell of smoke. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his eyes scanning her face for signs of abuse or injury. "Not physically," Victoria replied, and Jesse could hear volumes of meaning in those two words. "Then we need to move. This fire won't keep them distracted for long, and once Moorcock realizes you're gone, he'll have every man in the territory looking for us." Jesse helped Victoria onto one of the horses, a sturdy mare that seemed calmer than her companion despite the chaos surrounding them. As they prepared to ride away from the mansion that had been Victoria's prison, she looked back at the burning stable and felt something she hadn't experienced in weeks: satisfaction. Moorcock's prize horses were safe. Jesse had released them before setting the fire, but his property had suffered exactly the kind of violation that he had been inflicting on others for years. "Where are we going?" Victoria asked as they urged their horses into the darkness beyond the mansion's grounds. "Somewhere Moorcock can't follow," Jesse replied. "My grandmother's people have a saying, when the bear is angry, the wise rabbit runs to ground the bear cannot reach. We're going to ground that's been protected by treaty law since before Moorcock was born." They rode hard through the night, following trails that existed more in Jesse's memory than on any map. The storm that had provided cover for their escape grew stronger as they climbed into the mountains, with rain lashing their faces and lightning illuminating the treacherous path ahead. But Victoria felt more alive than she had in weeks, exhilarated by the simple act of making her own choices again. Behind them, the lights of Dead Rock Gulch grew smaller and dimmer until they disappeared entirely into the Montana darkness. Victoria. Hartwell was no longer Silas Moorcock's property, no longer trapped by the legal fiction that had reduced her to merchandise in a corrupt man's possession. She was free, riding through a storm toward an uncertain future, but riding by her own choice alongside a man who had risked everything to give her back her freedom. The real battle was just beginning, but for the first time since Garrett Sterling had destroyed her life with a handful of cards, Victoria felt like she had a fighting chance. And that feeling was worth any price she might have to pay in the war that was surely coming. Dawn broke over the Whispering Pine Reservation like a prayer answered, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber that seemed to promise sanctuary. From the storm they had left behind, Victoria and Jesse had ridden through the night, their horses picking their way along ancient trails that wound through forests where Dakota hunters had once tracked elk and buffalo. As the sun crested the eastern peaks, they finally reached the boundaries of land that existed under different laws than those that governed the white settlements below. The reservation sprawled across 15,000 acres of some of the most beautiful country Victoria had ever seen, with rolling meadows bordered by dense pine forests and crystal-clear streams that sang their way down from mountain glaciers. But more than its natural beauty, the land carried an aura of peace that Victoria could feel in her bones, as if the very earth beneath her horse's hooves was whispering promises of protection. Jesse's grandmother, Mary Crow Feather, emerged from a log cabin that sat beside a bend in the river like something from a fairy tale. She was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, but she carried herself with the dignity of someone who had seen empires rise and fall and understood that true power came from knowing who you were rather than what you owned. Her hair was silver as moonlight, braided with beads that caught the morning sun, and her dark eyes held depths of wisdom that made Victoria feel simultaneously judged and welcomed. "Grandson," Mary said, her voice carrying the musical cadence of the Dakota language, even when she spoke English, "you bring trouble to our peaceful valley." "I bring justice, grandmother," Jesse replied, dismounting and helping Victoria down from her horse. "This woman was sold like cattle by men who call themselves civilized. She needs sanctuary while we fight their corrupt laws." Mary Crow Feather studied Victoria with eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. Victoria felt herself being weighed and measured by standards she didn't understand, judged by a code of ethics that was older than the territorial laws that had enslaved her. After what felt like an eternity, the elderly woman nodded once. "She has been wounded in her spirit," Mary said, speaking to Jesse but keeping her eyes on Victoria. "Not just by the men who bought and sold her, but by the one who betrayed her trust. She carries anger like a poison in her blood." Victoria started to protest, to explain that her anger was justified, but Mary raised a hand that commanded silence, as effectively as a shout. "I did not say the anger was wrong, child. I said it was poison. There is a difference between righteous anger that seeks justice and bitter anger that seeks only revenge. One heals the world, the other destroys the person who carries it." The words hit Victoria like a physical blow, forcing her to confront truths she had been avoiding since the night Garrett Sterling had wagered her away. She had been so focused on her hatred for Moorcock, her fury at the system that had made her situation possible, that she hadn't examined what that rage was doing to her own soul. "Come," Mary said, gesturing toward the cabin. "You are safe here, but safety is not the same as healing. If you truly wish to be free, you must do more than escape your captors. You must escape the prison they built in your heart." The Whispering Pine Reservation operated under laws that predated white settlement by centuries, governed by council decisions and tribal traditions that valued community harmony over individual profit. Victoria found herself in a world where women's voices carried equal weight with men's, where decisions were made through consensus rather than force, where justice was about restoring balance rather than punishing enemies. Mary Crow Feather became Victoria's teacher in this new world, introducing her to concepts of healing that went far beyond the physical. The Dakota understanding of wellness encompassed mind, body, spirit, and community, recognizing that true health required harmony in all aspects of life. Victoria learned to identify the places where her spirit had been wounded, not just by recent events, but by a lifetime of being taught that her worth depended on male approval. In the white man's world, Mary explained as they walked beside the river, women are taught to be property, first of their fathers, then of their husbands, but the Creator made women to be the keepers of life, the ones who decide which seeds will be planted and which will be allowed to grow. How can a keeper of life be owned by someone else? Victoria absorbed these lessons like water soaking into drought-parched earth. She learned Dakota words for concepts that had no equivalent in English, ways of thinking about relationships and responsibility that challenged everything she had been taught about a woman's place in the world. Slowly, the tight knot of rage and despair that had taken residence in her chest began to loosen. Meanwhile, Jessie worked with Samuel Whitehorse, the Cherokee lawyer from Helena, preparing the legal challenge that would determine whether Victoria's freedom could be secured through the white man's courts. The case they were building was complex, requiring them to prove that the gambling debt was invalid because Victoria had never consented to being wagered, and that territorial law couldn't supersede federal protections for women's rights. But even as they worked on legal strategies, word came from Dead Rock Gulch that Silas Moorcock was not waiting for the courts to resolve the matter. He had posted a reward of $5,000 for Victoria's return, claiming she had been kidnapped by savage renegades who threatened the safety of all decent citizens. Bounty hunters were already scouring the territory, following every rumor and chasing every shadow in their hunger for the enormous reward. He's painting this as an Indian raid, Jessie told Victoria as they sat by Mary's fire one evening, and trying to turn it into a race war so the territorial authorities will have an excuse to send in the cavalry. Victoria felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Will they? Not onto reservation land, Jessie replied. The federal treaties are clear about that. But if we leave here, if we try to fight this in territorial court, we'll be walking into a trap. Mary Crow Feather looked up from the beadwork she was crafting, her weathered hands never pausing in their intricate patterns. Sometimes the trap is not where you think it is, grandson. Sometimes the hunter becomes the hunted. Moorcock's response to Victoria's escape was swift and ruthless, but it revealed the true extent of his corruption in ways that shocked even Jessie, who had thought himself prepared for anything. Within 48 hours of discovering Victoria's disappearance, Moorcock had mobilized not just bounty hunters, but territorial officials, corrupt lawmen, and hired gunmen in a manhunt that resembled a military operation more than a search for a single escaped woman. The territorial governor, a man named Bradford Ashworth, who owed his position to Moorcock's financial support, issued a proclamation declaring Victoria's rescue a matter of territorial security. He authorized the formation of citizen militias to assist in the search, and offered territorial resources to support the manhunt. It was a grotesque perversion of law enforcement, turning the machinery of government into a private army serving one man's wounded pride. Judge Blackwood issued warrants for Jessie's arrest, on charges of kidnapping, theft, and inciting Indian unrest. The warrants were based on Moorcock's sworn testimony and carried the full weight of territorial law, making Jessie a fugitive in every jurisdiction outside the reservation boundaries. Senator Vance used his influence to pressure federal officials, claiming that Jessie's actions threatened the delicate peace between white settlers and native tribes. He painted the rescue as the beginning of an Indian uprising that could spread throughout the territory if not stopped immediately. But Moorcock's most dangerous move was hiring the Donovan brothers, a group of manhunters who had made their reputation tracking down escaped slaves before the war and fugitive criminals afterward. The Donovans were known for their ruthlessness and their willingness to operate outside legal boundaries when the price was right. Their arrival in Dead Rock Gulch sent a clear message. Moorcock intended to have Victoria back regardless of what laws had to be broken or what blood had to be spilled. Word of these developments reached the reservation through a network of sympathizers that included white settlers who were disgusted by Moorcock's corruption, territorial officials who still had functioning consciences, and native traders who moved freely between the white and Indian worlds. Each piece of information painted a clearer picture of the forces arrayed against them. "It's not just about you anymore," Jesse told Victoria as they reviewed the latest intelligence. Moorcock has turned this into a test of whether he can use his wealth and influence to override federal law. If he succeeds, it sets a precedent that puts every native community at risk. Victoria felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. "Maybe I should just go back," she said quietly. "Maybe it's not worth risking a war over one woman's freedom." Mary Crow Feather, who had been listening silently from her place by the fire, spoke with the authority of someone who had survived decades of broken promises and betrayed treaties. "Child, there is no such thing as just one woman's freedom. When any person is denied their humanity, all humanity is diminished. When any woman is treated as property, all women are at risk." Jesse nodded grimly. "Besides, going back won't stop this now. Moorcock can't afford to let this challenge to his authority succeed. He'll crush us completely to make sure no one else gets ideas about defying him." As if to underscore his words, a young Dakota scout named Joseph Running Bear arrived at the cabin with urgent news. "Armed men are gathering at the reservation boundary," he reported breathlessly. "Maybe 30 or 40 riders, all carrying rifles. They're making camp just outside the treaty line, like they're preparing for something big." Jesse felt his blood turn to ice. The Donovans? Some of them, yes. But there are others too. Men from town, territorial marshals, even some cavalry. Soldiers in civilian clothes. They're not trying to hide their numbers. Victoria understood the implications immediately. They're preparing to violate the treaty. They're going to come onto reservation land to take me. "Not if we stop them first," Jesse said, his voice carrying a hardness that Victoria had never heard before. "It's time to remind these people that courage isn't the exclusive property of white men with badges." Mary Crow Feather set down her beadwork and looked at her grandson with eyes that held both pride and sorrow. "The spirits whisper of storm clouds gathering, Jesse. Are you prepared for the lightning that follows?" Jesse met his grandmother's gaze steadily. "I've been preparing for this storm my whole life, grandmother. The only question is whether I'll face it alone or with others who believe that some things are worth fighting for." As word spread through the reservation community, Victoria saw something that filled her with both hope and terror. The Dakota people were preparing to defend her, not because she was one of them, but because her fight had become symbolic of something larger, the struggle between those who would reduce human beings to property and those who recognized the sacred nature of every person's freedom. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just Victoria's fate, but the future of justice in the Montana Territory. And as the sun set over the Whispering Pine Reservation, casting long shadows that seemed to reach toward the armed camp beyond the treaty line, Victoria realized that her personal war for freedom had become something much larger and more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The confrontation that would reshape the Montana Territory began not with gunfire, but with words spoken at sunrise on a morning when the autumn air held the promise of winter's approach. Victoria stood on the porch of Mary Crow Feather's cabin, watching the sun paint the eastern mountains in shades of gold and crimson, knowing that this day would either secure her freedom or destroy everyone who had dared to help her claim it. Across The valley, the armed camp that had been growing for 3 days now, numbered nearly 100 men. Bounty hunters, corrupt lawmen, hired gunfighters, and territorial militia had assembled under Silas Moorcock's banner, all united by the promise of reward money and the shared belief that one man's will should override all considerations of law, justice, and human dignity. At their head rode Marcus Donovan, eldest of the notorious Donovan brothers, a man whose reputation for ruthless efficiency had made him the most feared manhunter in 3 territories. But what Moorcock and his army of mercenaries hadn't anticipated was the response their build-up would provoke from unexpected quarters. Word of the standoff had spread far beyond the boundaries of Dead Rock Gulch, carried by telegraph lines and newspaper stories that transformed Victoria's personal struggle into a symbol that resonated across the American frontier. Samuel Whitehorse, the Cherokee lawyer who had been preparing Victoria's legal defense, arrived at dawn with news that changed everything. "Federal marshals are 3 hours behind me," he announced, as he dismounted from a lathered horse. "And they're not coming alone. The territorial legislature has called an emergency session. The governor is facing impeachment proceedings. And most importantly, a federal judge has issued an injunction ordering all territorial officials to cease their support of Moorcock's manhunt." Jesse felt a surge of hope, but Mary Crowfeather's expression remained grim. "Paper and words have power, grandson, but only if men with guns choose to respect them. Look across the valley and tell me if those men appear ready to be stopped by legal documents." She was right, of course. Moorcock had invested too much in this confrontation to back down now. His reputation, his political influence, and his very identity as a man who could bend others to his will were all on the line. Even if federal authorities arrived to restore order, he would likely try to force the issue before they could intervene. The first test of wills came at 8 o'clock, when a delegation from Moorcock's camp approached the reservation boundary under a flag of truce. Marcus Donovan led the group, flanked by Judge Blackwood and Senator Vance, their expensive clothes looking oddly formal in the wilderness setting. Behind them rode 6 armed men, their hands resting casually on their weapons in a display of barely contained violence. Jesse met them at the boundary marker, a weathered stone post that had defined the limits of federal treaty obligations for more than 2 decades. With him came 3 Dakota elders, men whose presence added both dignity and implicit warning to the confrontation. These were men who remembered when promises made by white officials had been broken with blood and fire, and their faces carried the hard-earned wisdom of survival. "Crowfeather," Donovan called out, his voice carrying the casual authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. "You're harboring a fugitive on federal land. We're here to offer you one chance to turn her over peacefully before this gets ugly for everyone involved." "Miss Hartwell is not a fugitive," Jesse replied, his voice steady despite the tension crackling in the air between the 2 groups. "She's a free woman seeking sanctuary from men who would treat her as property." Judge Blackwood urged his horse forward, his bulk straining against his saddle as he attempted to project judicial authority. "Son, I've issued legal warrants for both the woman and yourself. Interfering with their execution makes you an accessory to kidnapping and theft. Stand aside and we might be willing to consider reduced charges." One of the Dakota elders, a man named Thomas Two Hawks, who had fought in the Indian Wars and survived 3 different government attempts to relocate his people, spoke with the quiet authority of someone who had learned to see through lies wrapped in legal language. "Judge, your authority ends at that stone marker. This is sovereign territory protected by federal treaty. Your warrants have no power here." Senator Vance's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. "Don't lecture us about federal law. Old man, the government that signed your precious treaties can revoke them just as easily. Push this too far, and you'll find out how quickly things can change." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a wildfire. revealing the ugly truth beneath. Moorcock's legal facade. This had never been about law or justice. It was about power, and the willingness of corrupt men to use that power to crush anyone who dared to challenge their authority. Jesse felt something shift inside him, a transformation that had been building. Since the night he'd first seen Victoria transferred like property between gambling men. "Senator, you've just made a threat against a sovereign nation in front of multiple witnesses. I'd say that's grounds for federal charges, wouldn't you?" Before Vance could respond, the sound of approaching horses echoed across the valley. A new group was riding hard toward the confrontation, but these riders wore the blue uniforms of federal marshals and carried the authority of a government that had finally decided to take interest in the corruption festering in the Montana Territory. The arrival of Federal Marshal William Hayes and his six-man detail transformed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. Hayes was a career lawman with a reputation for incorruptible honesty, the kind of man who had been sent to clean up territorial messes before and wasn't intimidated by local politics or hired guns. "Gentlemen," Hayes announced as he rode up to the boundary marker, his voice carrying the easy confidence of someone backed by federal authority. "I'm here to inform you that the gambling debt at the center of this dispute has been ruled invalid by federal court order. Miss Victoria Hartwell is no longer bound by any contract or obligation to Mr. Silas Moorcock." The silence that followed was so complete that Victoria could hear the wind moving through the pine trees half a mile away. Judge Blackwood's face went through several shades of red before settling on purple, while Senator Vance looked like a man who had just realized he was standing on quicksand. Marcus Donovan, however, was not a man easily deterred by legal technicalities. "Marshal, with all due respect, my contract is with Mr. Moorcock for the return of his property. Federal courts can rule whatever they want, but a deal is a deal." Hayes studied Donovan with the expression of a man cataloguing the features of someone he might need to arrest later. "Mr. Donovan, you're talking about kidnapping a free citizen on federal land. That's a crime that carries 20 years in federal prison. Are you sure you want to make that your position?" The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, with armed men on both sides, waiting for someone to make the first move that would determine whether this confrontation would end in justice or bloodshed. Victoria found herself holding her breath, acutely aware that her personal struggle had become a test case for the rule of law itself. The moment was broken by an unexpected voice, Garrett Sterling, riding up from the direction of Dead Rock Gulch, with his head hanging in shame and his expensive clothes wrinkled from hard traveling. Victoria felt her stomach clench at the sight of the man who had destroyed her life, but there was something different about him now, a brokenness that suggested he had finally confronted the full weight of what he had done. "Victoria," Garrett called out, his voice cracking with emotion, "I've come to make this right. I've brought legal documents transferring all my remaining assets to you as compensation for what I did, and I've prepared a full confession detailing how Moorcock manipulated the poker game that night." The admission sent shockwaves through both camps. If Garrett could prove that the original gambling debt had been obtained through fraud, it would destroy not only Moorcock's claim to Victoria, but potentially his entire network of corruption. Moorcock himself finally made his appearance, riding out from his camp with the desperate fury of a man watching his carefully constructed empire crumble around him. "Sterling, you spineless fool, do you have any idea what you're destroying with your pathetic attempt at redemption?" "I'm destroying a lie," Garrett replied, and for the first time since Victoria had known him, his voice carried genuine strength. "I'm destroying the fiction that men like you can buy and sell human beings and call it legal. I'm destroying my own cowardice." Moorcock's face contorted with rage that bordered on madness. "Marshal Hayes, that man is wanted for questioning in territorial court. I demand you arrest him immediately." Hayes consulted a document from his saddlebags, taking his time to read it thoroughly while the tension built to unbearable levels. "Actually, Mr. Moorcock, it's you who's wanted for questioning. Federal grand jury indictment for conspiracy, fraud, and violation of civil rights. You're under arrest." The words hit Moorcock like physical blows, staggering him in his saddle. Around him, his hired army began to realize that the ground had shifted beneath their feet. They had come here expecting to collect easy money for returning escaped property, but now they were facing federal charges for participating in a criminal conspiracy. Marcus Donovan was the first to recognize the changed situation. "Boys, I think it's time we headed back to town. This job just got more complicated than we signed up for." One by one, the bounty hunters and mercenaries began to peel away from Moorcock's camp, unwilling to risk federal prison for a man whose power had just evaporated like morning mist. Judge Blackwood and Senator Vance tried to slip away quietly, but Hayes's sharp voice stopped them cold. "Gentlemen, you're also named in the federal indictment. I'd appreciate it if you'd save everyone some trouble by surrendering peacefully." As Moorcock and his corrupt allies were led away in federal custody, Victoria felt something she had almost forgotten existed: the simple, profound joy of being free to make her own choices. The legal documents that Garrett had brought officially restored her independence, while the federal court's ruling established precedents that would protect other women from similar fates. But more than legal freedom, Victoria had found something deeper during her time on the reservation. Under Mary Crow Feather's patient guidance, she had learned to distinguish between the anger that seeks justice and the rage that seeks only destruction. She had discovered strength she didn't know she possessed, and wisdom that came from understanding her place in a larger community. Jessie approached her as the sun climbed higher over the valley, painting the world in shades of gold that seemed to promise new beginnings. "So, what happens now?" he asked, his voice gentle with understanding of all she had endured. Victoria considered the question carefully, aware that her answer would shape not only her own future, but potentially the lives of others who had risked everything to help her. "Now I think I'd like to learn more about building a different kind of world," she said. "One where a woman's worth isn't determined by which man owns her, where justice means something more than whoever has the most money." Mary Crow Feather smiled, recognizing in Victoria's words the wisdom that comes from surviving fire and emerging purified rather than consumed. "There is much work to be done, child. The fight for one woman's freedom is won, but the fight for all women's freedom has only begun." Samuel Whitehorse stepped forward with news that would reshape the entire territory. The federal investigation has uncovered evidence of corruption reaching all the way to Washington. There are going to be trials, reforms, new laws protecting women's rights. Miss Hartwell, your case is going to change how these territories handle marriage contracts and gambling debts. Victoria felt the weight of responsibility, but also the strength to carry it. "Then let's make sure those changes matter. Let's make sure no other woman goes through what I went through." As the day progressed, delegations arrived from across the territory, settlers who had been victimized by Moorcock's corruption, native communities who saw Victoria's victory as validation of their own struggles for justice, women who recognized that her fight had opened doors for their own liberation. The celebration that evening was unlike anything the Whispering Pine Reservation had ever seen, bringing together people from different worlds, united by their commitment to justice and human dignity. Victoria found herself at the center of it all, no longer the property of any man, but a woman who had claimed her own destiny. Jessie caught her eye across the firelight, and she saw in his gaze not the possessiveness she had learned to fear, but the respectful admiration of a partner who understood that true love meant supporting someone's freedom rather than limiting it. "You know," Victoria said, approaching him as the celebration continued around them, I never properly thanked you for what you did. You risked everything to help a stranger." Jesse smiled, and Victoria saw in his expression the quiet satisfaction of a man who had lived up to his own principles. "You weren't a stranger after I saw what they did to you that day. You were someone who needed help, and I was someone who could provide it. The rest was just details." As the stars emerged over the Montana Valley, Victoria Hartwell looked up at the vast sky and felt something she had never experienced before, the perfect freedom of a woman who belonged to no one but herself, who had chosen her own path and would walk it with the strength born of surviving the ultimate test of human dignity. The gambler's bet had been settled, not with cards or coins, but with courage and the unshakable belief that some things, freedom, dignity, the right to choose one's own destiny, could never be wagered away, no matter what laws or customs might say otherwise. And in the morning, when the sun rose over a territory that had been forever changed by one woman's refusal to accept that she could be bought and sold like cattle, Victoria would begin the next chapter of her life, not as someone's property, but as a free woman, whose story had become legend, whose courage had rewritten the rules, and whose love had found its home in a heart that understood the true meaning of partnership. The cards had fallen, the bets had been called, and justice had won the final hand. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.